The Nintendo Switch 2 has been out for 3 days. Whether you're a buyer, a boycotter, or just someone who prefers to wait to buy their tech, you've realistically heard one of two extreme statements. Either A, the Switch 2 has become the best-selling opening launch of all time, or B, this thing is in stock anywhere and nobody wants it. Much like everything else in life, the reality is, the truth lands somewhere in the middle of that. And regardless of how these 3 previous days played out, and how the upcoming weeks and months perform for the Nintendo Switch 2, history has shown us that the first 6 to 12 months of a console's lifespan are not necessarily indicative of how that console will perform in the long run. But since we're in the thick of all of this news, and it seems like everybody's already jumping to conclusions regardless of no factual data, I think it's worth analyzing both points of view and figuring out why the Switch is either A, flying off the shelves despite a lot of the negative backlash that it's received, or B, not moving nearly as much as all of the experts and all of the analysts had predicted. And a quick reminder before I begin that a lot of this discussion is theoretical because we do not have data. And that's something very important to remember. We still don't know how well the Switch's launch is actually done, and we do not know if the Switch 2 is going to be the greatest selling console of all time. Now, let's make an assumption here that the Switch 2 is selling as well as people are claiming it is. Let's say that 3 million number that's been pulled out of thin air is actually a real thing. Let's pretend Bloomberg's prediction of 6 to 8 million units early on in the console's life is coming into full fruition, and that the Switch 2 is indeed going to surpass the Wii U within the first few weeks, maybe a month or so. What are the key factors here that have led to its success? Well, I think there are a few reasons that are a lot more obvious than you'd think. It's not like you gotta dig that deep into it. First and foremost, the Nintendo Switch 1 has had an amazing life. Without a single price drop, with minimal bundles, this console has managed to sell over 150 million units. And it's even projected to sell another 4 or 5 million units after the Switch 2 is launched. Despite many of the criticisms about how weak the console is, despite it coming off of the back of the Nintendo Wii U, despite the Joy-Con drift, the ports, remakes, remasters, the first time there's a price to play online on a Nintendo console, and all of the general issues and complaints that come with playing online on a Nintendo console, fans of Nintendo have proven something very clearly. If the games are good, they're going to buy. If the consoles are affordable, they're going to buy. And as long as you're willing to make a bunch of Mario games, Zelda games, and Pokemon games, they are going to buy. And since the philosophy of the Nintendo Switch 1 is being moved straight into the Nintendo Switch 2, after a very healthy 7 years, a console that came out in 2017 with technology basically from 2015, now we sit in 2025 and people are ready to move up to the next level. And the Switch 2 is that next level. They took the best-selling game from the Nintendo Switch 1 and finally gave it a sequel. It's been 11 years since the last Mario Kart. To put things into context, if you're in your early to mid-30s, the first 2/3 of your life got all of the Mario Kart titles prior to Mario Kart 8, and the final third of your life has had Mario Kart 8. So needless to say, people are ready for the next Mario Kart. And there's a reality here. No matter what the Mario Kart is like, open world, dynamic tracks, costumes, characters, whatever the case may be, having those 2 words on the box side to side, Mario Kart, is enough to pique the interest of most Nintendo fans, because as the Switch 1 has shown, most people that bought a Nintendo Switch also played Mario Kart. And in addition to that, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom were both available for the Nintendo Switch 1. They didn't have as many sales as Mario Kart 8 did, but they were amongst the best sellers on the console. By Nintendo marketing them as launch titles for the Nintendo Switch 2, it becomes very appealing for one of 2 reasons. We're gonna set Tears of the Kingdom to the side for now since that came out later on in the Nintendo Switch's life, but Breath of the Wild came out in 2017. A lot of people picked up their Nintendo Switch and might have passed on Breath of the Wild because they bought it later on in the console's life. Or you could be somebody like me. I bought Breath of the Wild when it first came out, played it for dozens of hours. I'm not one of the people that put in hundreds of hours into the game, but I did put in a fairly respectable amount, and I have not played Breath of the Wild since 2017. And I'm somebody that loved Breath of the Wild. A lot of people have been criticizing it because they feel like it took away from the true 3D Zelda experience, and I like them both. I'll go back to a regular linear 3D Zelda title and play that. I'll play Breath of the Wild. Whatever the point is, I love the game. So now, by releasing the Nintendo Switch 2 edition, you've either given people a chance to finally buy into the game and get to experience it with better quality than what was seen before, or you incentivize people like me to go back and revisit the title by spending $10, or not even needing to spend the $10 if you have Nintendo Switch 2's expansion pass. Now, obviously, the discussion is a little bit more nuanced than this, but I myself, as somebody that played Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze on the Wii U, when it came out on the Nintendo Switch 1, I had to pay $60 if I wanted to play it on there. And not just simply paying $60 to play it on the Switch, I was paying $60 to play a more enhanced version of Tropical Freeze. In the case of Breath of the Wild, if I'm somebody that has Expansion Pass, I'm not paying anything extra. I get to revisit this old game that I bought 8 years ago, a game that I had loved, and now it looks and plays better. So for a lot of people, despite the fact that Breath of the Wild was a launch title for the Nintendo Switch, despite the fact that it was originally a title for the Nintendo Wii U, it's an exciting time for them to pick up their Nintendo Switch 2 and play through Breath of the Wild. And obviously, you also got Tears of the Kingdom in addition to that. Many of the similar reasons between those two games, except the only difference is that Tears of the Kingdom came out a few years ago, so it might be a little bit more fresh in people's memories. Early on in the Nintendo Switch's life, Breath of the Wild and Mario Kart carried it to success. And now, in the Nintendo Switch 2's life, the hope for Nintendo is that Mario Kart and Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom start it strong and allow it to move toward that same success that the first Switch saw. And then you have a few more quality of life improvements that people had been criticizing. So for example, the Joy-Cons were very small, you made them a little bit larger, easier to hold. The kickstand was awful on the Switch one unless you had the OLED model, and now they've improved the kickstand to make it a better experience. And then of course, you're getting something that many people have been clamoring for a very long time. If you get the Nintendo Switch 2, you get to play GameCube games. And I know this might sound insane to many people, but GameCube games alone being available for a subscription service is enough to get a sizable chunk of people to buy into the Nintendo Switch 2. So even if it seems like going into the Nintendo Switch 2, it's basically just more Switch, more classic games, more remakes, ports, remasters, and Mario Kart World, at the end of the day, if this console has actually had one of the best launches of all time, it's because Nintendo has been brilliant about it. They know what people want to play and they know what they want to do. They were smart about not fixing what was broken. They've found ways into enticing third parties into adding their games into the mix, and they've enticed Nintendo fans with a chain of upcoming games. And this obviously does not include some of the extra features that I didn't mention. Game chat, the mouse controls, and all the little up-res tweaks on your Switch 1 titles that you can continue playing on this new console. So there is incentive to buy the Switch 2, it's just a matter if it's worth it to you. And for many people, it is worth it. But for a large chunk of people, it's also not worth it. Leading up to the launch of the Switch 2, there was a very vocal group of people that just wanted a stronger Switch. That seemed to be the biggest thing that people were requesting. I won't make a sweeping statement like everybody wanted a stronger Switch, but I think it's very clear that the most vocal and outspoken people online definitely did. Because obviously, if you don't just want a stronger Switch, you're not going to go online and make dozens of posts about it. You're just going to enjoy your Switch. Now, Nintendo did deliver that stronger Switch. And I think for many people, even the ones that did not want to upgrade their Switch, did not really care too much to have just a stronger Switch. They were reluctantly on board because they like their Switch 1 a lot, and they want to play more Switch games, and a lot of the exclusive Switch games are going to end up on the Nintendo Switch 2, so they won't be able to play them on their Switch 1, so you know how it goes, they have to upgrade. So you either had people that were excited to just have a stronger Switch, or you had people that were kind of like, you know what, I've had the Switch 1 for a while, it's been fun, I'll upgrade when the new one comes out. And then obviously, the backlash of the Direct happens. The biggest reason for the backlash is the $80 price tag that was slapped onto Mario Kart World. At least, once again, that's the most vocal reason that we've seen online. Even many people that ended up buying the Nintendo Switch 2 have sworn that they will never buy an $80 title. Those people realistically ended up managing to snag one of the Switch 2s that came with Mario Kart bundled in, effectively for them knocking $30 off of the sales price. Others may have made a one-time exception because they weren't able to snag the bundle or because they wanted a physical copy and it's the primary launch title available, so they figured it's a one-time thing and I'm not going to do this again. But it seems like even people that love the Nintendo Switch hate the $80 price tag, and they don't think that games should be moving up to the $80 price tag. And that $80 price tag has rippled throughout the industry. You've seen Microsoft announce that their games are going to go up in price. There was a controversy on Twitter because of Borderlands for the $80 thoughts. And then you have even some non-$80 games that are getting a lot of attention because they're going up to $70. So, for example, in the Sonic community, the new Sonic Racing game was announced recently that it will be priced at $70. Their logic is pretty clear. If Mario Kart is worth $80, our game is worth $70. And that's caused a major backlash in the Sonic community now. It's not really fair to point a finger at Nintendo and say this is all their fault that other companies are charging higher prices. But at the end of the day, they are the ones that broke the barrier, causing game prices to move up across the board. They created the uproar, people have argued about it, people have accepted it, others have not accepted it, but the discussion has started and it will continue to wither away just like it does anytime the prices go up. And obviously, right now, it's as big of a deal as it is because we just barely hit the $70 price tag. So we're kind of just like flew right past that one. We got to the $80 one, and that's made the $70 price tag more acceptable across the board. Or at least it did for many people, and that's made it acceptable in the industry. Others will either have to find a way to get it on discount, or they'll have to buy it later. I would say that if the Nintendo Switch 2 is actually not having a successful launch, and it turns out that people are overestimating just how good it's actually going, this is the primary reason as to why. I think there are a ton of other reasons you can account in addition to it, but many of those other reasons aren't necessarily as important to the average customer. The price of the console, for example, is $450. This is a big deal for many, but I think for a lot of people, they also understand where the console market has blown up, and if everything else stayed the same, they would still potentially buy in. There is definitely a sizable amount of people that are against the $450 price tag, and I'm one of them, but it seems to not be as big of a deal for many as that $80 price tag. But that is also yet to be seen because we don't have sales numbers in yet. And for the Nintendo Switch, it had such a healthy lifespan because a lot of times people would go to the store and be willing to buy these consoles that were cheaper than the competition. Nintendo no longer has that advantage on the competition, so that could prove problematic for them over time. But again, I think just that Mario Kart $80 number right next to it is what really kind of set people off, more so than the $450 price tag. And then in the same way that many people were excited for the Switch 2 because they get to play their old Switch 1 games except in a much better light, that also could work against Nintendo. Many people are just seeing more of their Switch games and they're like, well, I already played this, why would I play it again on a Nintendo Switch 2? And if that's all they can think of, then that means you're effectively only buying the Switch 2 for Mario Kart, at least from a first-party perspective anyway. Welcome Tour is obviously not included with the Switch 2, but let's be real, even if it was included, nobody's buying the Switch 2 for Welcome Tour. It should have been a pack-in title, but it's not going to incentivize somebody to buy the console. Or at least, I would hope not. It's definitely not the type of tech demo as Wii Sports was, where it genuinely brought everybody in and got them to buy the console. So now you have many people out there that love their Switch 1, and then they look at the Switch 2 and they're like, okay, this is all just for Mario Kart. Is a $500+ investment worth it for me at this moment to buy the new console? To be one of the first people to buy this console, to effectively be the customer guinea pig, so to speak. And I think for many people, they don't mind the price tag, they don't mind anything else, but that's the issue. They don't want to just pay $500+ for Mario Kart, they rather wait it out and wait for more games to come in. And since the Switch 2 is effectively just a stronger Nintendo Switch, there's nothing really appealing about the hardware either unless you're looking to play your old games with an up-res. Even something like the mouse controls, which could be groundbreaking, the Switch 2 edition of Jamboree and Switch 2 edition of Metroid Prime 4, which would have shown off this technology, are not out yet. So even then, people have no reason to buy it. Not with the current outlook of prices anyway. If this was a console that was priced lower, let's say $350, let's say maybe even $400, then you might be able to stomach it and jump in and just wait for the games to come out. But effectively, for a lot of people, the only thing that you're buying this $500 console for right now would be Mario Kart. So in their minds, might as well just wait until there's more things to buy. These are definitely the biggest and most obvious hurdles for the Nintendo Switch 2 at launch. You have other things as well, and they're very important to many people on the internet. Controversies with the terms of service, digital ownership, game key cards, nickel and diming all around, potentially even a Joy-Con drift situation because it looks like these Joy-Cons are basically the exact same thing as the previous ones. These are all things that can and will stop somebody from buying a Nintendo Switch 2, but many of them were equally as bad on the Nintendo Switch 1, or at the very least they got close to it. And with the Nintendo Switch 1, a lot of people just shrugged it off. So potentially, and pretty likely actually, they will shrug it off for the Nintendo Switch 2 as well. But what happens is, it all sprouts from that $80 price tag for Mario Kart, and slightly less so that $450 price tag for the Switch. Once you see those numbers, and once you think about what you're buying into, you start thinking about all the other stuff that kind of falls in line right after it. And this is not to say that Nintendo is the worst in the industry. There are very scummy business practices when it comes to Sony and when it comes to Microsoft, and many people have already stopped supporting those companies, while others will reluctantly do so because it will give you the most powerful home console experience, and that for them allows them to ignore everything else. But in the case of Nintendo, their two biggest drawing points that allow people to ignore everything else that happens around the console have always been the price and the games. And the Switch 2 is launching with a single game and a very high price. That's obviously not to say that it won't eventually get more games. Nor is it to say that it won't eventually have a price drop either. History shows us that Nintendo will not go down in price unless there's an actual pushback and people are voting with their wallets, which means it's not very likely. But it is likely that people are going to have games that they can't say no to, offers they can't refuse, upcoming titles that will be announced and people will buy the Switch 2 for it. It's just that, unlike previous console generations, the price is too high to just buy without thinking about it. Specifically with the global economic conditions, and specifically with just the general outlook of modern gaming. When you look at how often new games are coming out for new consoles, it's very different over the past 5 years than it was previously. So maybe now each person has their own game that they know that they're going to buy the Switch 2 for, they're just waiting for it to be announced. Whatever the case is, as I said at the start of this video, I think both of these arguments that I've just made for the success and for the failure of the Switch 2 are likely true. I don't see this console in its current state being a success like the Nintendo Switch was, nor do I necessarily see it being a failure like the Wii U. I think it might actually have one of the best launches of all time, but I think that also largely depends on once we get the confirmed numbers of just how many Switches were sent out to retailers and how many of them sold out. Because if reports are to be believed, Nintendo sent out tons and tons and tons of units available to combat scalpers. But if everybody that wants a Switch 2 buys one now, it could be very top heavy in terms of numbers sold, which is a good thing, because now people that want to Switch can have it from day one. But it also means that we can't necessarily expect a consistent number of sales going forward over the first quarter, the first year even. So, like I said, I think the truth lies somewhere in the middle. It's entirely possible that depending on which side of the fence you sit on when it comes to what you wanted out of your Nintendo Switch 2, you can view this as a very successful transition into the next console and be very satisfied with your purchase, or you can view this as an absolute failure and feel vindicated for your assumption that the Nintendo Switch 2 would be a flop. And in both instances, depending on how you paint the picture for yourself, you would be right. And I think that clearly adds on to the current controversy around the Nintendo Switch 2. But much like with everything else in the gaming industry, only time will tell how this will move forward. There are many people that still want a Nintendo Switch 2, and they might not have one either because they're out of stock around their location, or because they're waiting for something to give. And if something gives, whether it's a price drop, a bundle, or a new 3D Mario for example, I think there are a lot of people that would no longer feel like they can skip out on this newest Nintendo console. Bonanza comes close for a lot of Nintendo fans, but I don't think it comes as close for the entire population of people that buy Nintendo stuff. Either way, regardless of whether this launch was a success or a failure, I think Nintendo succeeds by the end of this console generation. It just depends on the route they have to take to get to that success. There's a straight line of continuing on the exact same trajectory they're currently on, or there's a route where they'll have to bend a little bit to make naysayers happy. Only time will tell. In the meantime, the echo chambers will continue to echo, and in a few weeks, months even from now, when we finally have data and sales numbers for the opening launch window, we can have a better idea of where this is all going. Thanks again for listening, and I will catch you guys on the next one.